Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar focused on emotional intelligence for leaders. I am going to first just introduce myself briefly. I'm Dan Rust. I'm Infopro Learning's Vice President of Global Leadership and Organizational Development. Have been focused on the space of emotional intelligence for over 20 years, and we'll go into that in a little more detail. But in my role with Infopro Learning, I head up a team of researchers, developers, instructional designers, focusing on a broad range of leadership development topics and initiatives and training programs, emotional intelligence being one of them. In fact, we do have a program called Emotional Intelligence for Leaders. Today's webinar is not going to be just a walkthrough of that program. In fact, many of you, I would imagine, who are either listening to this or watching this, you're familiar with emotional intelligence, familiar with the topic in general. And what we're going to do today is actually talk through some of our most recent thinking, our most recent conversations, what we feel really is happening in the emotional intelligence space. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. If you happen to be one of the perhaps 3 people on the planet who has never heard of the term emotional intelligence, I'll at least bring you up to speed. Emotional intelligence was popularized almost 20 years ago by the author Daniel Goleman, but even at that point, when his first book, Emotional Intelligence, was published and became a national bestseller, a big sensation, definitely popularized the term and made it feel as if, oh, that was the beginning. But in fact, up to 10 years prior to that, researchers, developers, trainers, thought leaders in the area of workplace productivity, employee performance, basically lots of people were focused on the topic of emotions and emotional intelligence versus intellectual intelligence. And emotional intelligence began to be referred to as EQ versus IQ. And so just in case you happen to be one of those 3 people that isn't familiar with the term, here's a really quick definition for you. Emotional intelligence is a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how well we perceive and express ourselves, how we develop and maintain social relationships, both at work, at home, and basically every area of our lives, how we cope with challenges, both professional and personal, and how we use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. So that's the essence of emotional intelligence. And EQ, it really did, when Goleman popularized the term, it became not only an area of focus for training and development, it became a broad area of focus in personal development. And in fact, there was a huge amount of energy and time and resources dedicated to developing training programs. Additional books were published, lots of assessments were created, and I will say I was one of the folks who got on the EQ train as well. I developed my own what I called emotional effectiveness assessment, my emotional effectiveness assessment, whereas the broad term of emotional intelligence focused on 5 broad areas: self-awareness, social skills, self-regulation, empathy, and motivation. My emotional effectiveness skill map kind of broke that apart and went into a little more detail, focusing on self-awareness, confidence and self-esteem, self-control, authenticity, optimism and resilience, self-actualization, empathy, spirit of service, social awareness, interpersonal influence, communication, and cooperation, or a cooperative attitude toward others on a team. So I developed training programs around these competencies. I developed an online assessment around these competencies. So I've spent a lot of time in the emotional intelligence space. And the reason I I share my bona fides in this area is because we're going to be talking through some topics and kind of taking a point of view that may be questioning some of the accepted wisdom in the EQ area right now. And so I want you to know that this at least is a very thoughtful approach. I'm not just coming at this willy-nilly. But one of the questions I'm often asked is emotional intelligence a set of innate traits that simply it is what it is within each of us, or can it in fact be developed? And I'll give you my personal point of view. The research in this area is a little inconsistent. There is research that validates, yes, it is learnable, it's trainable, it's developable. But that research also reinforces that in order for an individual to truly develop greater emotional intelligence, it requires a concerted intent and effort on that person's part. It isn't as simple as, hey, I'll attend a webinar, or hey, I'll attend a training program. For true development of emotional competencies, it does take significant personal intent and personal effort, and ideally guidance or development from an informed resource. Also, what I found over the years is some of these traits were more, I'll use the term trainable than others. So communication, for example, developing greater emotional effectiveness in your communication with others, I found to be quite trainable because you share specific techniques, practices, approaches that can be implemented relatively easily in a straightforward way. So communication skills and showing more emotional effectiveness in your communication skills, trainable. Empathy, on the other hand, I found we struggled with when we would do before and after assessments of empathy. Empathy was one of those areas that just the needle didn't seem to move much after when you do an assessment 6 months after taking individuals through a particular development program. Now, I'll admit that could be because the training wasn't great. It's quite possible. But it just was interesting that some areas of emotional intelligence we saw the needle moving, other areas not so much. And that actually began a process for me in terms of questioning some of the accepted wisdom in the area of EQ or EI, as some people refer to it. And one of the questions that has come to me from other people, particularly over the last couple of years, is how relevant is emotional intelligence for leaders truly? Had a gentleman that I spoke with about a month and a half ago, and I would characterize him as being a leader with a high degree of emotional intelligence. He and I, we're not friends, but we've known each other for quite some time, so I know him relatively well. I've observed him in his work environment, and he is someone who operates with a high degree of emotional intelligence, emotional effectiveness. But he posed a question for me. He said, Dan, here's sort of the brutal truth of my career. I've kind of flatlined at the middle manager level. And when I look at the leaders above me in my organization, they don't appear to be particularly emotionally intelligent. In fact, they appear to be, to some degree, brutal and ruthless and politicking. And he said, I love our business. I love our industry. He said, this is where I want to be, but it doesn't feel to me like emotional intelligence is going to serve me well in propelling me in accelerating my career trajectory. And he went on at some length because he felt like what he needed to do was navigate some relatively uncharted waters for himself. Now, he acknowledged that having great self-awareness, and having emotional intelligence was helping him see this world that was ahead of him. But he just questioned whether emotional intelligence was, in fact, going to be helpful for him in the next phase of his career. And of course, my knee-jerk reaction when someone asks a question like that is, well, of course, emotional intelligence is absolutely going to be helpful. And it's almost, when you've been talking about this subject for 20 years or longer, when it's embedded into your thinking, the idea that someone would ask this question, my knee-jerk reaction was to push back and say, you're absolutely, and here's how it will be helpful, here's why it's helpful, here's why it's relevant. But he did cause me to pause, and because I know him as well as I do, I did pause for a moment, and it did cause me to ask some questions. Here are some statistics related to EQ. These come directly from our training program, in which we're referencing others and the research of others. But so this statistic, now this statistic goes back to 1990, but the research indicated that in most complex jobs, a top performer is 120% more productive than an average performer. And research conducted with over 200 companies worldwide indicated that those top performers, for them, 2/3 of the difference in their effectiveness was related to their EI, their emotional intelligence, and only 1/3 of the difference was related to their technical skills and cognitive abilities. And then further on, the research indicates, or indicated at the time, that in top leadership positions, over 4/5 of the difference between top leaders and average leaders is due to the emotional competence of those top leaders. So these are statistics. If you're familiar in the EQ space, you're probably familiar with these statistics. You've read either these exact statistics or something quite similar, where we are hearing over and over again what separates the most productive, the most effective, the most happy individuals in the workplace is not their technical or functional capabilities, it's their emotional it's their emotional capabilities. So we hear this again and again, but I'm going to take a moment and just kind of press the pause button. And I'm going to ask you, when you think about leaders today, and I've got a whole bunch of them, and there was no rhyme or reason. So I'm sorry if some of these leadership images trigger some of you, but I basically just pulled out, all of the mainstream names that I hear from Putin to Trump to Biden, but also names like Ernest Solberg in Norway and Liz Truss in the UK and others. But my question is, broadly speaking, when you think about EQ competencies, let's take Elon Musk, for example. Does Elon Musk strike you as a highly empathetic person? Now, maybe he does, or maybe you've hypnotized yourself to believe that he's a highly empathetic person, and maybe he is, in fact, highly empathetic, but most of what I read about Elon really doesn't seem to reflect a high degree of empathy. There is a high degree of technical capabilities, a high degree of engineering capabilities, but from a social skills standpoint and empathy standpoint, even a self-awareness standpoint, I don't know that I would call Elon Musk the poster boy of emotional intelligence. Now, I could be wrong. It's just a personal point of view. But when I think about people like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Mary Barra at GM, fine executive, exceptional executive, amazing executive. But my impression is not necessarily that emotional intelligence is her deepest strength, or the strength that has led her to the position that she's in. If anything, my impression is her strength has been her strategic thinking capability, her strategic analysis, and then her grit and toughness in a leadership role. So again, I'm asking you to ask yourself, when it comes to leadership, to what degree is emotional intelligence actually needed? To what degree does emotional intelligence actually contribute to leadership effectiveness? And if the answer you come to is in fact, oh yes, absolutely. Well, these 20 people are the exception, they're not the rule. Or in fact, if you really look carefully at how these 20 people operate, it turns out they are in fact highly emotionally intelligent. So maybe it's me being hypnotized by the media, but I don't perceive Putin as being incredibly empathetic, having great social skills, having great self-awareness. Um, and so many of these leaders I know work and operate in a bit of a bubble, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, so how that bubble actually can serve to diminish somebody's social skills and diminish somebody's capabilities in terms of emotional intelligence. But I just think we owe it to the leaders within our organizations, if we are in fact going to advocate for development of greater emotional intelligence in our leaders, we owe it to them to at least think deeply about what we're asking them to do and what we're sharing with them, and not just running forward to say, hey, EQ, it's more important than IQ. Is EQ more important than IQ? Is it really? There's a fair amount of research to validate that the number one predictive factor in employee success is intellectual intelligence, is in fact IQ. In fact, the three top predictors, if you just without pre-framing yourself in any way, if you just look at the baseline research, it tells you that in general, everything else being equal, the number one predictor of employee success is intelligence, intellectual intelligence. The number two predictor is previous success in a similar role. Now that requires you to really understand what the role is that you're hiring for, or what the role is that the employee is in. And having had previous success in a similar role is the number two predictor. The number three predictor comes somewhat close to being related to emotional intelligence. The number three predictor is intellectual flexibility, being able to connect the dots from one role to another role that isn't exactly the same, being able to connect the dots from one problem to another problem, from one situation to another situation. That intellectual flexibility may in fact be tangentially related to emotional intelligence. I would perhaps say that emotional intelligence, classically speaking, comes number 4 on that list. And again, I'm just looking at the research I'm looking at. So it may in fact be different than it is than how I particularly perceive it. But I think we owe it to leaders to at least think and rethink and make sure that what we're presenting to them is in fact based upon fact. So in my position, I do get a chance to talk to employees every week, not just employees of my company, but employees broadly of other companies. We're working on a variety of development projects all the time. We've got some field testing going on all the time. We're doing surveys all the time. So I'm talking to employees, but I'm also talking to leaders within both client and prospect companies. And in terms of today's workplace, what I'm hearing from employees is they want leaders who show more empathy. They want leaders who care about the growth of the employee, who don't simply see the employee as a cog in the system. They want what they would consider to be a fair work reward contract, and that perception of fairness is, of course, something that has shifted significantly over the last 20 years. It used to be, hey, you pay me well to do a job, I do the job, that's the end of our quote unquote contract. You pay me well and I will engage and do a good job. The definition of fairness in that work reward contract has definitely expanded. And I do talk to leaders who are frustrated by that, but it is a reality. And I don't know that we can wait for the world to change. I don't know that we should wait for the world to change. Even if the world in some way manages to shift back to the way it was, it's never going to be exactly the way it was. Employees, they want to reject menial work or mundane work, work that doesn't seem to really matter, real work that doesn't energize them, that doesn't juice them, as one employee said to me recently. Work-life balance, employees not only 10 years ago, work-life balance was a nice to have that you maybe talked about after you were on the job 6 months, 12 months later. After you've kind of proven yourself, then you start to talk about work-life balance. Today, work-life balance is not only talked about in the interviews by employees, they bring up work-life balance, but they bring it up with a level of insistence. And if they don't perceive your organization as supporting work-life balance, supporting the well-being and mental health of employees, they're going to move on to other places where they feel they can get that kind of support. And the final thing that I'm hearing from employees is they want to work for organizations whose values are aligned with them. And it's not negotiable. It's, again, not a nice to have. It is a must have. So when you get your head around all of these things that employees, I'm going to say want, but in many ways, whatever is in between want and demand, they may not be quite demanding of it, but it's not as simple as just a desire as well. It's a very insistent desire for these things in their work. It would make intuitive sense that one of the things in leadership that would help employees feel like they're getting what they want is a highly emotionally intelligent or effective leader, because an emotionally intelligent leader is going to have empathy, is going to have awareness of themselves and awareness of others, is going to be able to self-regulate and regulate their impulses, so to speak. In fact, when we talk to employees about what they're looking for in leaders today, and when I say talk to, some of that is actual talking to, some of it is reviewing their comments in some of our surveys. What they're saying is they want leaders who are able to think flexibly, who execute flexibly, who aren't simply on autopilot. They want leaders who will lead with inclusion and with transparency. They are asking for emotionally intelligent leaders. They are asking for transparency. They're asking for, they may not use the term psychological safety, but they're asking for psychological safety. They don't want to feel at risk. They don't want to worry about whether, because they spoke up and disagreed with the leader, that their role or their job or their career trajectory might be at risk. They're looking for mentorship from their leaders. Well, for a leader to want to be a mentor, to want to mentor emerging leaders in an organization, again, emotional intelligence will certainly help that and reinforce that. So I'm not in any way doubting that emotional intelligence on the part of leaders will help them help their employees, that it will make them a better leader for employees. I think perhaps my question is, does it also help them in their own career trajectory, their own career path? And at some point, does the utility of emotional intelligence start to diminish as you move into the upper ranks of senior leadership? I'm not absolutely asserting that it does or doesn't, but if you think about senior leaders in your organization, just ask yourself, to what degree is empathy exhibited in senior leadership? To what degree is self-awareness? To what degree are social skills? To what degree is self-regulation exhibited? And you may be the exception to the rule, but many of the conversations I have indicate that at a senior leadership level, emotional intelligence is not necessarily their strength and does not seem to be limiting their career success. So this does beg the next question for me, which is, okay, so we've been focusing on emotional intelligence for employee development and leadership development for over 20 years, and my question is, how successful have we been? Are we creating a wave, or have we created a wave of more emotionally intelligent leaders, broadly speaking? I can certainly point to individual leaders. I can point to individual development programs, individual initiatives. I can even point to individual organizations or companies where there was a concerted effort to enhance the emotional intelligence of their leaders. And I can point to the needle moving in those finite places. But my question is, more broadly speaking, with so much money, billions of dollars, untold hours, and untold commitment and investment of time, of energy into this topic of emotional intelligence, you would expect to see the bar rising significantly. Plus, as I said earlier, employees are looking for it. Employees are hoping to see it. Employees would like to work for leaders who are more emotionally intelligent. So what does the data tell us in terms of, broadly speaking? When you look at emotional effectiveness, either from like the broad, like 5 competency standpoint, or the deeper competencies or categories that I shared earlier, there's been some interesting data that's come out over the last 20 years. We have been, starting back in 1999, I deployed a survey called the Corporate Culture Map Survey. Went out to about 80,000 employees for a variety of organizations globally. Pretty broad range of demographics and psychographics within the survey. And the survey focused on a broad range of categories related to employee engagement. And one of those categories was specifically the authenticity of leaders, the emotional intelligence of leaders, asked a number of questions, asked for anecdotal comments from leaders. And that survey has been repeated for the last 20, now 22 years. Survey questions have been maintained to be almost exactly the same. The scale of the survey has gone from about 80,000 to now somewhere around 200,000 employees each year complete the survey. And as you look at the aggregate results, there are 2 things that I look for in the survey related to emotional intelligence. And one is leaders' perception of their own emotional intelligence. And interestingly, if you look at leadership self-perception, over time, leaders seem to be perceiving themselves as more emotionally intelligent. They are answering questions in a manner which seems to indicate, okay, slowly but surely, we're increasing the emotional intelligence of leaders, particularly since about 2015. The cynical part of me wonders if, because during the last 7 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on the kinder and gentler leader, becoming more empathetic as a leader. And I wonder if leaders, in some way, they know what the right answer is, and perhaps in some way they are, in fact, just simply convincing themselves that they've become more emotionally intelligent, or maybe they in fact have. But all we know for sure is that it's a measure of perception. We don't know if it's an actual measure of reality. But at the same time that the self-perception of leaders has moved slightly upwards, the employee perception of their leaders in terms of leadership EQ has been a gradual trend downward, even in the face of billions of dollars, untold time and energy invested. Now, I've talked to a lot of people about these numbers just to kind of gauge what they think, what might be contributing to this trend, where it appears that leaders, from an employee perspective, are becoming less emotionally intelligent. And I've heard theories. For example, one theory is that the expectations of leaders are evolving more rapidly than leaders themselves are evolving. So while they may be getting better, the expectation is increasing more rapidly than they are getting better, is one thought. Another person's thought was that social media tends to viralize the juicy examples of less than stellar leaders. And so it creates an erroneously negative perception among employees. So it may be that media in general, social media in particular, is creating a more intense negative perception. We know that when surveyed, employees today are more likely to rate their managers or leaders more harshly than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They're just more comfortable being harsher on a scale of 1 to 5, whatever the scale might be. Employees are just less likely to rate their leaders at the top, even if they really like their leader. Giving them a 5 just feels not as natural as it perhaps did 20 years ago. And then another theory is that emotional intelligence may improve a leader's popularity with employees, but does not necessarily correlate with the leader's effectiveness. So we talk about it, but we don't necessarily do anything about it. Again, this is a thought that was shared with me as I've been talking to a variety of people about, so how do you think it's really going from the standpoint of emotional intelligence of your leaders? And I hear more examples of less than stellar emotional intelligence than I do hear examples of, oh, absolutely, we've got a leadership team that is highly approachable, highly self-aware, highly empathetic. The employees feel very confident in both the competence and the caring of the leaders of the organization. It's still relatively infrequent to hear comments like that. And so I thought I would share with you my personal theory regarding how you can spend so much time and energy and money investing in emotional competence development with leaders and have it not seem to produce an output that is equivalent to the amount of resources that you're investing in that output. And so I have a term that I use called the leadership bubble. And what I mean by the leadership bubble is we are all surrounded by a bubble, so to speak, between ourselves and other people. It's very rare. I would say it's just unheard of to be fully transparent with another human being where you share everything that you're thinking in exactly the way that you're thinking. Even with your very close loved ones, we tend to edit to some degree. We tend to control to some degree. We tend to refine to some degree what we share with them. So the only exception with human beings is with infants and very young children who have not yet realized that their parents can't actually read their minds. Infants and very young children tend to simply say exactly what they're feeling, exactly what they're thinking, and it takes a while for them to learn the behavior of refine first, think about your thinking first, decide what you share. And you know that if you have children, there comes a point the first time your child realizes, oh, there's a thing called lying where you say something that's not true. It's a moment of realization for children where they start to realize, well, what I say and what is real doesn't always have to be exactly the same thing. Now, by the time we are in our teens and our 20s, by the time we're adults, we've well passed beyond that stage. And so we all have a bubble surrounding us to some degree. The leadership bubble is a bit thicker, a bit stronger, a bit bigger, because whenever a leader has any degree of control over the livelihoods, over the careers, over the futures, over the environment of the people that work for them, inherently that control, that power, even if it's just a little bit of power, is going to affect the way people interact with them. So if you're a team leader of a team of 8 people, those 8 people are not going to treat you the same exactly as they would treat you if you were merely a peer. Because you have power, because you have influence, they are going to be a little more have a little more deference toward you. You may perceive it, you may not perceive it, but the truth is, the longer you lead within an organization, the higher you move up the leadership ladder, the bigger the bubble grows, or at least the tendency of the bubble to grow becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And that leadership bubble, I believe it's just simply a fact. You will never eliminate the leadership bubble. As long as you have power over someone else, there will be a bit of thought about what they share, thought about what they say. Some of it may be even unconscious. You may have people who actually, if you were to ask them, hey, do you filter what you say before you deliver it to whoever? Their honest answer may be absolutely not. I deliver the information, I deliver truth as truth. They may actually believe it, but in fact, there is always some degree of a bubble. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are employees who will absolutely say, the last thing I ever do is bring to him bad news. Because what we've learned over time is the first thing that happens is the deliverer or the messenger of the bad news gets shot. And then the shooting, continues downward. So that's an extreme, but we know it does occur. So we know that successful senior leaders are oftentimes aware that a bubble exists, and CEOs like Walt Bettinger, the CEO of Charles Schwab, he has made the statement very clearly that the leadership bubble takes the form of people telling you what they think you want to hear, and people being fearful to tell you the things that they believe that you don't want to hear. And he has stated, again, publicly, that minimizing the bubble is job number one for him, that he needs to hear the bad news as soon as the bad news is available, even if it's small bad news or big bad news. He needs people to feel that he's approachable, and that information can come to him. The reason I share that with you for this conversation is simply to confirm or validate that the leadership bubble exists. Now, the bubble is caused by a number of things. We have a natural tendency to avoid conflict, particularly with leaders. We would like to avoid conflict. Who wants to have conflict with their boss? Who wants to have conflict with their boss's boss? When it comes to our leaders, we tend to water down difficult feedback. We do not necessarily feel comfortable. Let me ask you, do any of you have a leader who consistently shows up late for meetings? Or do you have a leader who consistently, whenever there are meetings, feels quite comfortable taking those meetings off track? You plan a meeting with a particular intent, and because the leader that you bring into the meeting has something else on her mind or his mind, they feel very comfortable simply taking the meeting off in a direction that you hadn't planned for. Do you have a leader whose meetings tend to go long? Do you have a leader whose emails tend to be lengthy and rambling? Do you have a leader who is, let's just say, wanting in any particular way or set of ways, and yet you find yourself thinking, do I want to make a thing out of the meeting tardiness? Do I want to make a thing out of this or that? We do have a tendency to water down our feedback with leaders. We also have a tendency toward extreme politeness with leaders. We love their ideas. We love their jokes. I remember an experience with a leader when I was working for a large multinational company. The leader loved to tell jokes at the beginning of his large speeches, and he always thought that he killed because people laughed at his jokes. But his jokes were lame. They weren't even good dad jokes. They were like whatever is less funny than a dad joke. Those were his jokes. But people did laugh. The audiences laughed, but it was more, I don't know, it was laughing out of extreme politeness. And so he actually had this weird sense that he was actually pretty good on stage and pretty funny on stage, and in fact he was just not. So his self-awareness was very, very low. Sometimes our strategic decision making can be biased, and that can contribute to the bubble, and flattery and opinion conformity can contribute to the bubble. So if we accept that for leaders, the bubble exists, and there are a lot of forces that build the bubble up. So I want you to think about these forces that build the bubble up within the context of, okay, you've got a leader or a group of leaders who are going through an emotional intelligence training program where they're being assessed for their current emotional intelligence level, and they're being given coaching and direction on how to develop greater emotional intelligence. So imagine that activity happening in one area of the leader's life. And then in another area of the leader's life, they're experiencing these kinds of things within their culture. They're experiencing extreme politeness, extreme flattery. They have people who are avoiding healthy conflict, avoiding criticism. And I ask you, which of the two is ultimately more powerful in influencing the leader? While training certainly can be powerful, can be effective, can be influential. You would hope. I mean, it's the reason I've been involved in training and development for my entire career. You would hope that training can make a difference and move the needle, and it certainly can. But culture, not only there's an old Peter Drucker phrase, culture eats strategy for lunch. I think culture also eats training for lunch. And so this natural human culture towards the leadership bubble really works against emotional intelligence. It works against emotional effectiveness. Now, does that mean we should give up? No, of course not. And I'll talk a little bit more about some things that we can do. But I think it means if we're going to take on the task of helping leaders develop greater emotional intelligence, we have to address the issue of the leadership bubble and give them some guidance in terms of, number one, that the bubble exists. Whether you perceive it or not, the bubble exists. What can you do to minimize the bubble? What might you be doing inadvertently that is thickening the bubble or making the bubble larger? But if you live in a bubble where you are not getting great natural human feedback from others, you just tend to perceive yourself in a way that is not connected to reality. When you think about it, I'm going to use an example that perhaps many of us can relate to. Take someone like Prince Charles, or now King Charles III. If you were to talk to people about King Charles's social skills, most neutral observers would tell you that he has always been wanting in the area of social skills. He has not been particularly adept at social skills, but he does not perceive himself that way because he lives in a bubble in which his capabilities are oftentimes augmented, reinforced. He lives inside a bubble that actually makes him feel quite adept, socially speaking. And I'm just using King Charles III as one very extreme example because he's lived in a bubble his entire life. So I think he's a great example of what really happens to you when you do not exist with real humans for decades, how that ultimately can affect you. The same is true with us, perhaps to a lesser degree. So I thought I would ask you some rhetorical questions. Obviously, here you can't literally answer me, but I thought I would ask some rhetorical questions just to get you thinking for a moment about your leadership bubble and maybe even asking yourself, do you actually like it? Because there are leaders, they may not think of it in terms of a bubble, but they have created a bubble that they kind of like. Because think about it, if you don't really care about the natural, normal, authentic human interactions, the bubble can be kind of cool. People laugh at your jokes more. They think your ideas are fantastic. They think you are wise and smart and profound and insightful. And it's what a great way to live inside that bubble. So there are leaders who, consciously or not, actually kind of like living in the leadership bubble. So let me ask you, do your typical interactions with people tend to energize you or drain you? And I'm not judging. For some of us, Human interactions are naturally energizing. For some of us, they are naturally draining. Neither is inherently good or bad. It's just important to recognize that trait within yourself. Because if human interactions tend to drain you, that may contribute to your tendency to build a bubble around you. You know, I know for me, I'll be transparent with you. I tend to get drained by human interactions, and there are a lot of times where I have to go back into what I call my mental cave, where I have to spend time thinking, spend time preparing, spend time contemplating, because I do need my batteries to be recharged when I'm in my quote unquote cave. Um, Next question: do others perceive you as approachable and safe, so to speak? And probably the more important question: how do you know? You may perceive it. You may think of yourself as approachable. You may think of yourself as safe. I wouldn't. I'm not going to hurt anyone. I'm not going to. I'm not going to shoot the messenger if they bring me bad news. You may perceive yourself that way, but how do you know how others perceive you? Um, in your 360 feedback surveys, if your organization does 360 feedback surveys, are people asked confidentially how approachable you are? If you don't have some mechanism for people to give honest, confidential feedback, I'm not sure how you would know for sure whether you are viewed as approachable or not. When was the last time someone told you that you were dead wrong about something? Where someone came to you to say, look, that was a mistake, or that was an error, or that opinion is not based upon facts, or in some way. I mean, they could do it politely or even abrasively. You know, sometimes when I do occasionally have someone who kind of comes at me with tough information in a kind of abrasive, or less than what I would think of as optimal way, the one thing I do appreciate is, wow, it's great that you are so comfortable being so rude. There is like there's a little bit of joy in that. I still don't exactly appreciate the rudeness, but I do think, well, that's good. At least there's no filter. So that's a pretty cool thing. Next question: how comfortable are you publicly acknowledging your own faults and failings? Um, these are important questions for leaders to answer as they're gauging the reality of their bubble, because leaders who work within bubbles generally, number one, they don't perceive that they have a lot of faults and failings. And then when they do, they are not comfortable sharing them publicly. That will that will diminish my leadership brand. That will diminish my credibility. That will diminish the perception of my competence, and I certainly can't be viewed as less than competent. So I'm not going to debate the wisdom of that on this webinar. I'm just going to say that an emotionally intelligent individual, an emotionally intelligent leader, understands the value of leadership authenticity, and also understands that perfection is rarely authenticity. Most people understand we all make mistakes. We all have flaws. None of us does everything absolutely correctly. And if your leadership brand seems to be implying that you are, in fact, one of those rare few perfectly formed leaders without faults or failings, we all instinctively know that's not authentic. I may not be able to see the cracks in your armor. I may not be able to see where your faults lie, but the fact that you are creating this impression of perfection, I will be inherently suspicious of that impression of perfection. And what we see with emotionally intelligent leaders is they strategically and intentionally share some of their faults. They share some of their imperfections because now that doesn't mean they air all their dirty laundry. That's not what I'm saying. I don't mean you have to share with the world everything that's not perfect about you, but I am saying that a comfort with authenticity is a huge indicator of leadership emotional intelligence, and authenticity brings with it faults and failings. Um, Another question, do you spend more time and energy talking or listening and observing? And I would ask you to just think about that carefully. If anything, write a note to yourself and observe yourself over the next couple of days, because we do know that emotionally intelligent leaders, it's not the same with everybody, but they tend to spend at least a little more time listening and observing than talking, than espousing. If you are the talker all the time, well, you can't be the listener. And when you are listening, if you're listening to debate, or if you're listening to win the argument, or if you're listening to make sure that they are communicating what you want them to communicate in the way you want them to communicate, that's not actual listening. That's not actual observing. I'm talking about truly engaging in back and forth dialogue with individuals. Um, and the last on this list of questions, and the reason I like this list of questions is we do share these in our actual training program related to emotional intelligence for leaders, because we ask leaders to take a hard look at themselves and not simply do a formal assessment, which of course we do, where you do an online assessment and you get your graph and you see your strengths and your development opportunities. But we ask leaders to think about the bubble around them, because if you can't do something about the bubble, almost nothing else matters. You've got to find a way to minimize that bubble, and then you're going to come closer to an authentic relationship with others that actually can help you be informed and to learn from your interactions with others, as opposed to being protected from those natural interactions. Another question is, how long do you tend to wait quietly for others to answer your questions? When you ask a question and someone begins to answer, how comfortable are you interrupting them? Or do you tend to wait quietly and let them fully express their answer? What I notice with the leaders who have a high degree of emotional intelligence, they understand that they do need to give people time to thoroughly answer. They don't quickly cut people off. They don't quickly interrupt people. And the reason I like to focus in on this interruption pattern, or this interruption habit, is because it's a bit of a telltale. If you are an interrupter, that tells me perhaps a lot of other things about you. It doesn't just tell me that you're not listening. It may tell me a lot of other things about the way you're processing the world around you. So I think interruption patterns with leaders are a good thing to focus on, because it does tend to reveal what's the actual mindset of that particular leader. So my thesis related to emotional intelligence for leaders, my thesis is that while we have spent a huge amount of time and energy and resources training leaders to be more emotionally intelligent, guiding them to develop greater emotional intelligence, that one of the factors limiting that training and limiting the effectiveness of all of that training has been the leadership bubble. And until we guide leaders through a process of keeping that bubble down to the absolute minimum possible, we're not going to get the full benefit of our emotional intelligence training, which is why in our emotional intelligence training, we actually address the leadership bubble up front, and we try to give leaders some time to work through and begin actually putting into practice new practices to minimize the leadership bubble from the very get-go, because it's important that we not dampen or diminish the impact of the rest of the training that they're ultimately going to go through. So I think there are 4 things that a person can do. You cannot burst the bubble. Do not convince yourself that you'll be able to eliminate the bubble. You won't. But you can, number 1, cultivate approachability and empathy. And I use the term cultivate intentionally because, if you're a non-empathetic leader, it's going to be hard. It will be challenging for you to change your empathetic mindset, but it's not impossible. Over time, you can cultivate a higher degree of approachability, a higher degree of empathy. Over time, you can develop more trusting relationships, and trust has to go both ways. So trusting isn't simply that they trust you, but also that you trust them. So thinking about how do you as an individual create a deeper, more trusting relationship, and what can you do? What can you bring to the table? What trusts can you give to others in the hope, of course, that they will reflect back and ultimately give more trust to you as well. And I'm going through these things pretty quickly because we're coming close to the end of our time today. But the third thing that I recommend is that you truly own your mistakes. If you make a mistake in judgment, own it, and don't simply own it in your mind. Own it verbally with others, particularly if it's a mistake that others are probably aware of anyway. If you've hired someone into a particular role, and within, let's say, 6 months or a year or some period of time, it's clear it's not working out, and you end up letting that person go. I think it's important that the people who worked with that person, the people in your work environment, many of them may have been more aware of that person not working out sooner than even you were, but they are very much aware that this was an error in judgment. It was not a great hire. I think it's important that you actually acknowledge not only that there was an error but acknowledge the why behind it and what you've learned from it. If you make a hiring mistake, or if you try to convince yourself it wasn't a hiring mistake, it wasn't a mistake, the market shifted, or this happened or that happened. It really wasn't. It wasn't an error in judgment. It was an error in something else. Honestly, if you hire someone into a role and within 6 months that person does not work out, in all likelihood, it's an error in judgment on your part. And it's okay to own it as long as you've thought about it and decide, well, what did I learn from this? If you don't learn from it, then you're going to be repeating that mistake. And my intent behind this is simply there are mistakes that happen that everyone around you knows were mistakes. They know they were errors in judgment or errors in insight or errors in process or whatever the errors might be. And the degree to which you step forward and own those and learn from those is going to do a lot to minimize the bubble around you, because people, again, are going to perceive you as being authentic, and they will realize, oh, I don't have to be perfect. She's not perfect. And so I don't have to be perfect. So I can feel more comfortable sharing with her what's really going on, not having to pretend to create something that ultimately feels perfect but isn't real. And then finally, fourth element is just to elicit and appreciate honest feedback. At least once a year, I try to do it more frequently, but at least once a year, I have a one-on-one with each of my direct reports, and the essence of that one-on-one is me asking, let's just talk about how I'm doing. And I know I have to work hard to make them comfortable, and I hope that I've earned over the course of the previous year, earned their trust, and I want to know, how am I doing as a leader? And I'm looking for those adjustments, those suggestions. And if you don't elicit and appreciate honest feedback, you're never going to minimize the bubble or keep the bubble to the minimal level possible. So out of respect for everybody's time, I want to end this exactly on time. We started at the top of the hour. We're going to end right at the top of the hour. Very much appreciate you attending today's session. Appreciate your attentiveness, your engagement. And I know we'll be following up with a link to this recording. So if you want to go through it again, or if you want to share it with someone else, you are certainly willing to, or we would love for you to share it with someone else as well. So thanks, everybody. We have other webinars coming up. Hope to engage with you at some time in the future with a future webinar as well. Thank you. Bye-bye now.